The First Congregational Church of North Brookfield celebrates the sanctuary building's 200th anniversary in 2023. Though the church as an organization was already over 70 years old when the building was built, the creation of the sanctuary in the center of town marked an important milestone in the history of both the church and the town. This video will look into how it came about and some of the subsequent changes the building has seen over the last 200 years. The story of the building does not begin in 1823. It begins as far back as 1748, when residents of the northeastern part of Brookfield, which at this time contained the current towns of Brookfield, West Brookfield, and North Brookfield, requested that a meeting house be built in what was called the Lower Village, in the area of Ward Street, South Main Street, and Fulham Hill Road. Note that Bates Street has since been changed to connect to the end of Ward Street. Many had complained about the distance they had to travel for worship every Sunday to the Brookfield Meeting House on Foster Hill, in what is now West Brookfield, a journey of about 4 miles. This request would create a second precinct in the town of Brookfield. At this time in colonial America, rural communities were organized around the local church. The creation of a new church required the creation of a new political jurisdiction. The church, and the area it served, was known as a precinct, parish, or district, and acted as the government on the local level. Meeting houses built with public funds were understood to be for congregational worship as well as civil and legal use, and citizens within the jurisdiction were required to both attend services and pay taxes to support the church. Religious teaching was seen as vital for the development of a proper citizen, and as such, no attempt was made to separate church and state. The petition for a separate precinct was voted down at the Brookfield Town Meeting in 1748. The refusal by the town led to another petition, this time to the Massachusetts General Court in Boston, asking that their request be granted. The following year, to show the seriousness of their intentions, the petitioners erected a frame for their own meeting house in the Lower Village. After some negotiating, the second precinct in North Brookfield was incorporated on March 29, 1750. This created the boundaries for what would become the present town of North Brookfield. Some of the townspeople were unhappy with the location of the meeting house frame, so a committee of 3 disinterested men was called to determine the final place for the building. They decided it was best to complete the construction where the frame stood in the Lower Village, though many disagreed with their decision. A large stone marker now sits near the site where the building once stood. The location of the local meeting house was a very important matter. The only practical means of transportation were either by foot or on horseback, so everyone had a vested interest in where the meeting house should be placed. Usually the house would be built close to the geographic center of the village to even out the travel for all, like in this 1830 map of Spencer. But in the new precinct, the southern portion was already more populated. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Snell, the longest-serving minister in the church's history, who pastored from 1798 until his death in 1862, wrote that early in his ministry in North Brookfield, the area was so rural that there were barely 3 or 4 gigs in the entire town, and even umbrellas were luxury items. If it rained, the townspeople took on the storm as they traveled in small groups the 2 or 3 miles to the meeting house every Sunday. In the early 1800s, a series of laws were passed in Massachusetts that slowly removed the support of religion from government and opened the way for other denominations to settle in New England. In 1811 specifically, A religious freedom law was passed that allowed other denominations to use their tax money to support their own churches by forming a society, the society taking the place of the local established church. By 1833, this law was expanded so that no one was required to support any religion with their taxes. This meant that the traditionally government-supported Congregational churches also had to form societies, which now raised funds to support the minister and the church building. The primary method of fundraising for all churches was through the sale of pews, or more precisely, renting each pew to the highest bidder, with the better pews fetching higher prices. In North Brookfield, this practice was used until 1874, when it was changed to the free will offering method currently used. For much of its modern history, this church was known either as the First Congregational Society or the First Congregational Church and Society of North Brookfield. Despite the new laws, in many towns the church and town hall continued to use the same building for a time, with the cost of maintenance divided between the town and the society. North Brookfield likely continued to support the church until 1839, when the First Congregational Society was created, though it is not known for certain since the town records were destroyed when the townhouse burned in 1862. The first meeting house was a plain, rectangular, two-story building. Later on in 1789, two porches, or enclosed stairways, were added to replace the original internal stairs to the balcony, creating more room for pews. Reverend Snell reported that the motivation for the addition was not simply to provide additional pew space, but also to assure the permanence of the building's location, as there was still dissatisfaction among the community. The building was painted a yellow ochre with Spanish brown doors and lead white window frames. Construction of the building was slow. Snell said that it took a decade from the time the frame was erected before the building was completed, mainly due to the lack of money that the villagers could contribute to the project. The Meeting House in Fremont, New Hampshire, is an excellent example of this style of building. It is one of only two twin-porch meeting houses still standing in the United States. Built in 1800, it provides an opportunity to see what North Brookfield's meeting house was like. Freeman Walker, brother of Amasa Walker and a leading citizen of North Brookfield, described his recollections of the original meeting house in the July 3, 1877 edition of the local newspaper, the North Brookfield Journal.
The house was without a steeple and nearly square in form, with porches on the east and west end used as vestibules to the entrance at each end of the building. The front door was on the south side and opened directly into the body of the house, and a wide aisle passed from it to the center of the pulpit. A tier of pews passed from the pulpit round the walls of the church, crossing the main aisle at the door and the pulpit.
The floor in the middle of the house had 12 benches with backs, 6 on each side of the broad center aisle or alley. The men were seated on the right, while the women were seated on the left, though by the end of the building's use, these benches had been replaced with box pews. Another notable difference between the two buildings was that, other than the pulpit area, the interior of North Brookfield's meeting house was never painted.
In front of the pulpit was a seat with a flat desk or table before it, which was called the deacon's seat. The table was used for communion services as at the present day. The seat and desk was also used by the moderator of town meetings, which were always held in the church. Under the pulpit, the black powder and cannonballs that towns were by law requested to keep was stored, much to the alarm of the congregation when a thunder shower came up during divine service. The old pews were seated on two sides and usually had 1 or 2 chairs set in the middle of the pew as extra seats for the aged and infirm. The gallery of the church remained as originally seated as long as the church stood, with the exception that there was 1 tier of pews on the east and west side. Those seats were appropriated to different classes and ages with the greatest regularity. The front seat for aged men and the women seated by themselves, and the different seats back of them for children, youths, and young men, each class keeping distinct from the others with the most scrupulous exactness. One thing ought to be known in regard to the old meeting house. There was no provision made for warming it. In the coldest weather, the congregation had to sit in the cold, and in the latter days of the old house it was no more comfortable than an ordinary barn. The windows would rattle in the wind enough to drown out the voice of the speaker.
Even Reverend Snell noted that the fruits of his labor were mostly lost on the coldest Sundays, as everyone was anxiously awaiting the end of the service so they could thaw out from the morning's freeze. The time came when a new, larger meeting house was needed. Freeman Walker writes,
It was no doubt that the old meeting house was used too long, or was suffered to remain in a shabby condition, much to the discredit of the town. Most towns in this vicinity had put up what were then called modern churches, with steeples, with improved architecture, and it was felt the town ought to do the same. And many was the joke and slur cast upon North Brookfield on account of their meeting house. The wags of the day said that they had always heard of the Lord's house, but never knew he had a barn until they came to North Brookfield. All acknowledged that we ought to have a new house, and the question was long agitated, the difficulty being to agree upon its location. The town was divided on this subject into north and south. The southern and western portion decided to build on the old ground. The north and east at some point as far north as the church's present location. This state of things continued for nearly 20 years. The question came up repeatedly in meetings called to consider on that subject, but so nearly balanced was public sentiment that neither party dared to proceed to build a house. The town was surveyed, and the center was found to be a few rods west of Kendrick's house on School Street. The final result was that the society agreed to choose a locating committee from out of town, whose decision would be final and binding. The committee fixed upon the site of the first Congregational house.
During the summer of 1823, the new church building was built, and on the last Sunday of that year, the final service was held in the old meeting house in the lower village. The old meeting house continued to be used for town meetings, and the fledgling Methodist Church held services there during the summer months. But by 1832, it had fallen into such a state of disrepair that it was considered an eyesore, and after the first townhouse was built in 1833, the precinct voted to sell it at auction. One of the stipulations for its sale required that the purchaser either have the building repaired and painted or demolish it within 1 year. It sold for $123 and was demolished. The porches, which were newer, were removed from the building and joined together to make the small house at 276 North Main Street, across from the Herard Lane Estates. Those who continued to protest the location of the new church building wanted to see the meeting house repaired and again used as a house of worship. After the society disposed of the building, they hastily constructed a new chapel on the same ground as the former meeting house, and it was dedicated by the Methodist Church in January of 1833. Unfortunately, by March of 1835, this new house of worship was in financial trouble due to low membership. The church hobbled along, finally settling with creditors 5 years later. In 1854, this chapel was moved to Spring Street to be closer to the town center, and during its renovation it was destroyed by fire on February 24, 1854. The fire was thought to have been the work of an arsonist. This was the same year that the first Congregational church split and the Union Congregational Church formed across the street, erecting what is now known as the Union Star Building, so the fire may have been sparked by sectarian rivalry. The Methodists continued to meet in various places, including the first town hall until they constructed their own church in the early 1860s next to what was then the high school, now the Grove Street School Apartments. On March 18, 1822, the parish voted 58 to 46 to build a new meeting house. As Mr. Walker said, there was a significant disagreement over where to place this new building. Reverend Lyman Whiting, a native of North Brookfield and a witness to the building's construction, stated many years later that
a moral heroism was shown in taking up such a work with a majority of 8 in the face of a minority of 46.
As mentioned before, a complicating factor was that although the new meeting house would be in a more central location, there were few houses in the north side of town at this time, and the families that were there were generally poorer and were less able to afford to purchase a pew to fund the church. Along with the improved location, Reverend Snell stated that the area where the church now stands was, quote, a far more sightly and pleasant spot, and a territory very eligible for building and business, unquote. In May of 1823, the locating committee called by the society gave their recommendation of building the church at its present location, and laid out stones to mark where the building should sit. Their report was accepted, and the corner lot, containing 1 acre and 130 rods by measure, which was then a grain field, was bought from Daniel Gilbert for the sum of $300, or about $8,600 today. Although all agreed to adhere to the committee's decision, Reverend Snell reported that about 15% of parishioners withdrew their membership out of protest, though most eventually returned. Before the church was built, the only houses in the immediate area were Tyler Batchelor's residence, which soon became Batchelor's Shoe, and the Walker House, which still stands just north of the old cemetery. Summer Street did not yet exist. The only house within a mile to the east was the Kendricks residence at the top of the hill on School Street, and to the southeast on Elm Street was the Tyler farm, now at the intersection of Chase Road. Reverend Whiting said that looking west from the steps of the church,
no house could be seen but a small cottage beyond the burial ground. The whole space in front was a rude rock pasture. Take away all the buildings now in sight, but those 3 or 4 dwellings, all of them old, and then estimate the life and character gathered within the radius of a mile around this house of God in these years.
There were few forests in the Brookfield area even when the European settlers first arrived. The Native Americans routinely burned the landscape to keep the area clear of new growth. It was said that hunters could stand on their doorstep and see a deer as far as 1.5 miles away, and horsemen could ride where they pleased, unhindered by the lack of trees. Elias Carter of Brimfield, shown here in his later years, was chosen to build the new church. Born in 1781 in Auburn, he had built several churches as well as other buildings in New England and in the South before constructing the church in North Brookfield. His plans incorporated many of the features found in his other churches. Through the spring and early summer of 1823, oxen from local farms dragged huge timbers to the building site. The upper timbers of white pine were cut from the plains that were to be flooded to make Furnace Pond, or what we know today as Lake Lashaway in East Brookfield. On May 29, 1823, the town gathered to watch the raising of the frame. The building committee voted to invite 60 young men to help with the raising, none over the age of 30. The sections of the church frame went up whole, dead-lifted using ropes and poles without any mechanical assistance. The work was dangerous. Any slip or breakage would have been devastating and possibly fatal. Fortunately, there were no injuries during the construction. Residents said that Carter could be heard shouting, right up, from great distances as the work was done. Carter himself was carried up on the first plate as it rose, a common practice of the builder. Crowds who had gathered to watch the raising were sold gingerbread and lemon drinks by church members from wooden stands on the north and west sides of the common. Most of the raising was done on the first day. The following day, local carpenters installed the roof, and some weeks later there was another gathering to raise the porch and base of the steeple, which was said to be higher than any in the area. Unlike the first meeting house, this church building was finished quickly. By November, there were painters on staging finishing up the interior. Everything was handwork, including the doors, window sashes, and ornamental parts. Much of this was probably done by Elias Carter himself, since he had the reputation of being a fine woodcarver. The bell in the steeple was paid for separately by the congregation, and it was the first ever to be rung in North Brookfield. The day it was hung, the rope was made available to anyone who wanted to try their hand at ringing it. All afternoon the clamor was kept up, and the school children were let out to listen to it. The original steeple bell was replaced in 1851. The new and present bell was cast by Henry N. Hooper and Company of Boston. Reverend Whiting also described the atmosphere as the new church opened its doors for the first time.
The dedication day drew near. The thought and converse of the people was toward this house. The wardrobe of the town took on a new quality and care. I well remember the neighborly consultations as to it. The new and beautiful sanctuary sent its reviving waters into the everyday cultures of the people before they passed its thresholds. The singing men and women were in training for weeks for the day of anthems and hallelujahs under Mr. Rufus Gould of Oakham. It was a time of preparations. The chosen day, Thursday, the 1st or New Year's Day of 1824, came, a clear, sharp winter day. Ministers and people from adjoining towns came in numbers to share in the glad dedication services. The inhabitants met them with glowing welcomes. The house was densely filled. The singers came in procession from Tyler Bachelor's, the ladies laying aside their huge bonnets so they could better keep in tune and time in singing. The long drooping curls then worn, moistened to help the coil, so stiffened in the frosty air 'twas said that they rattled in the walk. Reverend Mr. Snell preached from Haggai 2:9. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former. Now began a new day in the life of this town. It had been a profitable schooling to the people to have considered, debated, disagreed, and got over it, so learning how to sacrifice private choices for public good. The town felt better, were better, after the tug of town meeting combats and the good victories from them.
It is not commonly known that the church building has gone through 4 major renovations that have drastically altered its interior appearance. The first being in 1842, again 10 years later in 1853 when the building was lengthened, once again in 1874, and finally in 1892. In the town of Mendon, Elias Carter built another church, only 3 years earlier in 1820. The church in North Brookfield was nearly identical to this model. Today it is the Unitarian Congregation of Mendon and Uxbridge, and it still remains largely the same as it was originally constructed, save for a vestry now attached to the back. The large middle door is a prominent feature of this design. Although there are no photographs or drawings of North Brookfield's original church interior, Reverend Whiting provides a description of the original pulpit, which closely matches that of the Mendon Church.
The pulpit was of choice carpentry. It stood upon 4 slender pillars with convex fluting and fine capitals. A tall man could stand under it. A closed stairway against the wall led the minister into the ample enclosure above and apart from the people. The center curved outwards, the 2 sides curved in reverse. A rim of scarlet tapestry ran around the whole, with pendant fringes and tassels. In place of a rear window or curtain was a slight recess with a fluted pilaster on each side upon which rested an arch, in the curves of which were gilt balls divided by a keystone tablet bearing the figures in gilt, 1823. The space under the arch was of clapboard work, as if a curtain painted green. A well-carved centerpiece, a lotus flower, enriched the ceiling. It lost its place and existence in the lengthening of the house in 1853.
It is worth mentioning that the pulpit you see now was lowered early in its history to allow more comfortable viewing for the congregation on the ground floor. The pews were of the box type with high walls and no slant to the backs, and doors held shut by wooden toggles. The two churches also share the same balcony decoration and similar columns above the foyer. The original floor plan from the First Congregational Church's record book shows that, like the church in Mendon, there were 3 doors leading into the sanctuary, a center aisle, and columns supporting the balcony. There were also windows along the east wall. A drawing of the church from the early 1850s shows the large middle door at the front of the building with fan windows above each. The iron boot scrapers for this door are still in place on the top step. The total cost of the building and land, not including the bell, was $6,000, or approximately $175,000 today. It was funded entirely by the church organization, with no tax money used for its construction. By 1836, more room was needed for worship. The town had grown thanks to the burgeoning shoe industry, and the transition from an agricultural town to a manufacturing town had begun. In March of that year, it was voted to enlarge the church. Elias Carter was consulted, and he suggested that the building be cut in two and the eastern half moved to allow the building of a new center section. As strange as it sounds today, this was a common way to enlarge a building, as it was easier than constructing a new post and beam end wall. However, this plan was abandoned when the committee instead settled on a full renovation of the sanctuary. The renovation work did not begin until 1842, and the changes made to the interior were dramatic. The original pews were sold off and replaced with larger box pews. The pews in the balcony were also replaced with seats that matched the new pews on the ground floor. A new, lower, and more modern-looking pulpit was installed. The lower pulpit required that the church floor be raised up 15 inches at the building's entrance and slope downward towards the pulpit. This is the reason for the 2 steps up from the foyer. This slope remains today, and the only clues to its existence are the varying heights of the radiators along the wall, and of course, when something is dropped or spilled in the sanctuary. The columns that supported the balcony were removed to free up floor space, and the balcony was suspended from above by iron rods. These rods would be removed and reinstalled several times through the next 120 years. The 6-foot-wide decorative centerpiece in the ceiling was also to be removed and replaced with an opening of lattice work for ventilation, similar to this one in the townhouse, though it has a removable cover. But this was not carried out due to ceiling joists directly above the opening. A new communion table was also purchased for $25. This is possibly the same table in front of the pulpit today. The decorative arch of wood behind the pulpit was also changed out for an unspecified plaster device to better match the new furnishings. The large interior doors from the foyer were remodeled to fit the new aisle layout. The old church began to give way to more modern tastes. Carpets were laid in the aisles, in the foyer, on the pulpit, and within every box pew. Spit boxes for each pew were installed to protect this new carpet from those who chewed tobacco during the service. Cushions of drab-colored damask fabric brought a level of comfort to every pew, including those in the balcony, and even the flat backs of the box pews were padded with this same material. New, open stairways to the balcony with closets underneath replaced the original staircases. Outside the building, lightning rods were installed on the roof. Shutters were placed on every window, the area in front of the steps was paved with gravel, and for the first time in the church's history, there was an effort to beautify the common. A picket fence was erected around the grounds, and shade trees were planted. Many of these original trees were damaged and cut down after the hurricane of 1938, and new ones replaced them. Only 10 years later, in 1852, more room was again needed due to a revival during which more than 100 new members joined under Reverend Christopher Cushing, the new associate pastor with Reverend Snell. A committee was appointed to consider whether a separate church should be formed instead of enlarging the building. The committee recommended that the church should remain as one, and that the plan for enlarging the building move forward. A group that was dissatisfied with Reverend Cushing and the church's approach to abolition was unhappy with this decision and withdrew to form the Union Congregational Church across the street. Despite many attempts to reunite the two churches over the years, they remained separate. In 1894, the church built and relocated to a large Gothic structure on the corner of Spring Street, and in 1905 they became Christ Memorial Episcopal Church. Due to faulty construction, part of the building collapsed in 1937, leaving only the chapel section remaining today. Despite the loss of members, the enlargement of the church building was begun. A construction firm was engaged to add 19 feet and 10 inches to the east side of the building. From the parking lot, you can see that the original church foundation ended just beyond the emergency escape door. This puts the original wall of the church just in front of where the current pulpit stands. The new eastern wall had one window on each side on the second story, and an external recess of 3.5 by 12 feet to house the brand new pulpit. The new floor space was filled with pews that extended as far as where the parlor door is now. The decorative centerpiece in the ceiling, now no longer in the center of the church, was removed and replaced with two new openings for ventilation. Chandeliers of oil lamps were suspended from these openings. The faint outline of the original centerpiece can still be seen in the plaster to the west of the chandelier. The crawl space under the church was also dug out during the enlargement to allow firewood to be stored for the heating season. In several annual meetings, the subject of constructing a vestry on the common was considered. It wasn't until 1854 that two sets of plans were presented for a building of 32 by 50 feet, one for a single-story building, another for 2 stories. Before the end of that year, a single-story building was constructed. Only 5 years later, in 1859, it was raised to 2 stories to house the newly donated Appleton Library, which also included a reading room and a study for the pastor. This is the reason the upper and lower windows are of slightly different sizes. Today, this building is called the Fellowship Hall. In 1856, Deacon Tyler Batchelor, church member and owner of Batchelor Shoe, presented the church with a clock for the steeple. This clock was originally owned by the church, but when the mechanism needed replacement in 1911, the church approached the town to help with the costs. Despite some controversy about the church and town entering into such an agreement, the town appropriated $500 for a new clock, which was installed in 1915, and the town continues to maintain it as the town clock to this day. In 1874, another major overhaul of the church took place, and the church begins to resemble what we see today. The box pews on the lower level were replaced with more modern bench pews with slanted backs. These are the same pews in the church today. They were installed at a cost of $7 each. The largest and most noticeable change during this remodeling was the installation of the organ. Built by Hook and Hastings of Boston, it is similar to, but smaller than, the one in Mechanics Hall in Worcester. The organ cost $3,000, equivalent to almost $80,000 today. The organ originally required a strong man to hand pump the bellows to provide the wind, but in 1915, a Spencer steel orgel-blow electric blower was donated to the church and installed in the basement. The organ can still be manually pumped today should the need or desire arise. The original plans called for this new organ to be placed in the balcony on the west end of the sanctuary, similar to the church in Mendon, though the balcony would have to be moved forward 3 feet to accommodate it. However, putting the organ in the pulpit recess eliminated the need for extending the balcony. With the recess now filled, the entire front of the sanctuary needed to be remodeled. The pulpit was moved forward 10 feet and lowered once again. The platform was enlarged to provide space on either side of the organ for the choir, who had until this time sang from dedicated seats in the west end of the balcony. To give those in the balcony an unobstructed view of the new pulpit, the railing was reduced 6 to 8 inches. This is what makes the balcony seem so precarious today. The 2 remaining windows on the east wall of the church were covered over, apparently on the inside only, as one window was still visible in a photo of the town taken in the 1880s. New 6-pane windows with corded weights replaced the original multi-pane windows. These windows are still in place today, though the screens and storm windows were added later. As part of the remodeling of the foyer, the 2 side windows, one on each of the sides of the foyer, were replaced with doors, though they are no longer operable. Originally, these doors did not have windows. The stairs to the balcony were also given new steps and curved railings of black walnut. Both the large middle door on the outside of the church and inner middle door from the foyer to the sanctuary were removed at this time, and the 2 smaller side doors on each end of the foyer added. In the oldest known picture of the church, taken just before the Soldiers' Monument was presented in August of 1869, the edges of the original arched doorways of the church can barely be seen. Interestingly, one of the recommendations of the 1874 Committee on Repairs was to have the entire church building raised 3 feet and the basement fully excavated to allow rooms to be built under the church, providing space for meetings and Sunday school. This is a similar arrangement to what is underneath the fellowship hall today. The stairs to the balcony were to be extended down into the basement, and a brick wall was to be built on top of the foundation stones to lift the building with the help of iron columns under the floor. 16 windows around the brick wall would light these rooms. Obviously, this was not undertaken. The L connecting the chapel to the church is the most recent addition to the building, comparatively speaking. Known as the church parlors, it was added in 1886 to connect the 2 buildings and provide space for gatherings too large for church members' homes. Following a plan submitted by the minister, Reverend Sedgwick Wilder, the women of the church raised the money, managed the construction, and furnished the new building. It was dedicated on September 14, 1886. The final renovation took place in 1892, and most of the changes were made to the front of the church. The organ was moved to its present location in the southeast corner to give the choir more room, and the platform for the pulpit was greatly enlarged. The curved wood paneling and the pulpit furniture date to this time. Theodore C. Bates, a man heavily involved with many public projects in town, including the library, waterworks, and railroad, provided the funds in 1906 to bring gas and town water into the church. He also donated the impressive copper chandelier in 1907. This chandelier was able to be powered by either gas or electricity, and until electricity was installed in 1916, it provided light through gas fixtures. One of these original gas lighting fixtures is still in place in the stairway to the pastor's study in the fellowship hall. Much has changed in the town and church over the last 200 years, and this only covers the events surrounding the sanctuary building. Jeff Fisk's excellent book, The History of the First Congregational Church of North Brookfield, published in 2005, details much more of the church's overall history as well as the earliest years of the town and the individuals that made them what they are today. Should the building still stand in another 200 years, we can be sure that those celebrating the church would still be in awe of the rich history of the church in the center of town.